Hello friends, welcome to our story. Before we start, please like this video and subscribe. Also tell us in the comments where are you watching from. New York, London, maybe South Africa or Jamaica. We want to know. Richard Calloway did not look like a man who had ever been afraid of anything. At 61 years old, he carried himself with the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from iron discipline. The sort of discipline built over decades of early mornings, cold decisions, and the quiet burying of everything that threatened to make him human in a room full of people who were watching. He was 6 feet tall, still broad across the shoulders, still with a jaw that could have been carved from the same granite as the lobby walls of Calloway Group headquarters in downtown Chicago. His suits were made in London. His watches were made in Switzerland. His silences, the ones that lasted entire boardroom meetings while his senior directors shifted in their chairs and loosened their ties, those were made right here, in the middle of his own chest, forged over years of practice. The Calloway Group was not a small operation. It was a conglomerate of logistics, infrastructure, and supply chain management with active contracts in North America, West Africa, and Southeast Asia. 43,000 employees, 14 subsidiaries, a revenue figure that appeared in the business press every quarter, and that Richard himself had stopped finding impressive sometime around his 53rd birthday, when the number became abstract enough that it ceased to mean anything except leverage. The offices were impressive, certainly, the kind of glass and steel architecture that communicated power before anyone inside opened their mouth. Richard's corner office on the 38th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over Lake Michigan, and on clear mornings the water turned a shade of deep blue that was almost indistinguishable from the sky, and sometimes Richard stood at those windows for 10 minutes at a time before his first meeting and stared at the line where the two blues met and thought about absolutely nothing, which was the only meditation he had ever managed to practice with any consistency. He had a personal driver named Collins, a security detail that rotated in shifts, a personal assistant named Dana Reeves who had worked for him for 11 years and who knew, without being told, exactly which calls to put through and which to redirect, which meetings could be moved and which could not, and which silences from her employer meant he needed coffee and which meant he needed to be left completely alone. Dana was 44 years old, efficient without being cold, professional without being invisible. She had learned to read Richard Calloway the way a sailor learns to read weather, not by what was visible, but by the small shifts in pressure that preceded everything significant. Richard was wealthy, unquestionably, dramatically, historically wealthy, and he was completely, profoundly alone in a way that the wealth had never once managed to address. 6 years ago, on a Tuesday evening in November, when the roads outside Greenfield were slicked with early rain, and the visibility on Route 9 had dropped to almost nothing, Richard Calloway's oldest son, Ethan, had driven off a rain-soaked curve and into a ditch that turned the car into something that the paramedics on scene described, in their report, as a compression event. The coma lasted 11 days. The death, the one that was reported, the one that was documented, the one that Richard was called about at 4:17 in the morning by a voice he had never heard before speaking words he had never prepared himself to receive, came at the end of those 11 days, according to a certificate signed by a physician at a hospital 200 miles from where the accident had occurred. The casket was closed at the recommendation of the medical examiner. The funeral was held on a Friday. 60 people attended. Richard stood at the front and shook hands with every single one of them and said, "Thank you, and yes, and he was a good man, and I know, and he did not cry. Not in front of anyone." He went home afterward to the penthouse on Michigan Avenue, and he sat in a chair in the kitchen with a glass of bourbon that he did not drink and stared at the refrigerator for 3 hours until the sun came up. And whatever happened to him in those 3 hours was a thing he had never described to another living person. Margaret, his ex-wife, Ethan's mother, a woman of considerable grace and genuine warmth, who had loved Richard faithfully through 27 years of marriage before the grief and the silence and the unbridgeable distance that came after their son's death had finally worn through the last thread between them. Margaret had cried for both of them, and for all the time they had lost, and for the boy they had raised together, and for the marriage that died, along with the son it had failed to survive. She and Richard separated 2 years after the funeral, quietly, without lawyers at first, without bitterness, with only the specific sorrow of two people who had shared something irreplaceable and found, at the end, that the sharing had not been enough. Richard sold the house in Lincoln Park where Ethan had grown up. He did not buy another family home. He moved into the penthouse and hired people to fill the roles that a house required: cleaning, cooking, maintenance. And he worked, which was the one thing he had always known how to do better than anything else. There was one property he did not sell: the house in Greenfield, a 2-story building of dark red brick on the corner of Millrace Road, and a quiet street that had no official name on any map Richard had ever seen. Only the name the neighborhood used: Plum Street, because of a plum tree that had stood in the lot across the road for as long as anyone could remember, and that was gone now. Cut down, though no one could say exactly when. Richard had bought that house in Greenfield before the money, before the conglomerate, before any of it. He had bought it for $22,000 when he was 28 years old, and already convinced that he was going to build something that would outlast him. Ethan had learned to ride a bicycle in the packed dirt backyard of that house. He had skinned both knees on those same bricks when he fell off the porch railing at 7 years old, and Richard had carried him inside and cleaned the wounds and told him, in a voice that he tried to make gentle, but that came out firm because firmness was the only register he knew, that pain was information, and that information was never your enemy. The house had been on the demolition list for 3 years. The paperwork had been drawn up twice. Twice, Richard had canceled it. Dana had stopped asking why. She had simply noted it, filed it under the category of things that did not require explanation, and moved on. On the 3rd Wednesday of October, Richard traveled to Greenfield for a site inspection on a new distribution hub being built 8 miles outside the town. The project was on schedule. The regional director gave a presentation that confirmed what the reports had already said. Richard shook hands, declined the offered lunch, and got back into the car that Collins had waiting. He did not ask Collins to take him to the airport. He asked Collins to take him to Millrace Road. Collins, who had been driving Richard Calloway for 9 years and had long since learned that certain instructions did not invite conversation, simply adjusted the route in silence. They pulled up in front of the house at 2:30 in the afternoon. The October light was the pale, thin kind that comes just before the clocks go back. Low and golden and slightly melancholy, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look like they are already remembering themselves. The house sat behind the iron gate, which was closed but no longer locked, the chain having rusted through at some point over the past year. Weeds had pushed up through the cracks in the brick path that led from the gate to the front porch. The porch itself, that same porch where 7-year-old Ethan had fallen and bled on the painted wood, was gray and weathered, one of the railings leaning at an angle that suggested it was more committed to falling than to standing. Richard opened the car door before Collins could reach it. "Wait here," he said. Collins nodded. Richard pushed the gate open, the hinges protesting with a sound like something tearing, and walked up the path toward the house. The October air smelled of dry leaves and cold coming and something faintly sweet that might have been the ghost of the plum tree across the road, or might have been nothing. His dress shoes clicked on the brick path. His breath made small clouds. He was not sure why he had come here. He never was when he came, and he had come 4 times over the past 3 years. Never telling anyone, never going inside, always standing at the gate for 10 or 15 minutes, and then getting back in the car. Something about the house held him. Not sentiment, which was a word he associated with weakness and with the kind of nostalgia that prevented forward motion. Something else. Something that did not have a clean name. He climbed the porch steps. The wood groaned under his weight. He stood before the front door, which was latched but unlocked. The lock had been broken so long ago that even the vandals who had passed through once, years back, had left it that way. He put his hand on the door and pushed it open. The smell that met him was dust and old wood and something that had been closed too long. The specific smell of a house that had been holding its breath. The hallway was dim, the light coming through the grimy windows in thin bars. The wallpaper was peeling in long strips above the staircase. The floor was gritty under his shoes. He walked into the front room. His footsteps were very loud in the silence. He stood there for a moment, looking at the empty room where the Christmas tree had stood the year Ethan turned 12. The year Margaret had strung too many lights and the fuse had blown, and they had spent half of Christmas morning with a flashlight and a fuse box, and everyone laughing in a way that Richard had not managed since. He was about to turn back. And then he looked up. At the window on the second-floor landing, visible through the gap above the staircase, there was light. Not daylight. Not the cold, pale gray of October coming through old glass. This was the warm, amber light of something burning. A candle. Or a lamp. Richard stood very still. The house had no active electricity. The service had been disconnected years ago. He had signed that paperwork himself. He listened. No sound. He put his hand on the banister, tested it with his weight, found it still held, and began to climb the stairs. Each step announced him. The light was coming from the room at the end of the landing. What had been the guest room, later Ethan's studio when the boy had gone through his brief, intense period of trying to learn the guitar at age 16, and filling the house with the sound of badly played chords that Richard had complained about and privately, secretly, found he missed the moment Ethan had given it up. Richard walked to the door. He stood in front of it for what might have been 30 seconds, or might have been 3 full minutes. Time had done something strange in this hallway, and he could not account for it. He opened the door. The figure inside was seated on the floor with his back against the far wall, a camping lantern on the floor beside him, casting that warm amber light upward and sideways and throwing his shadow large against the cracked plaster of the ceiling. He was thin, thinner than he should have been, wearing worn jeans and a flannel shirt that had been washed so many times the pattern had gone nearly flat. His hair was longer than Richard had ever seen it, and there were lines around his eyes that had not been there 6 years ago. But the eyes themselves, the shape of the jaw, the way the hands rested on the knees, index finger and thumb touching in a slight circle. A habit, a specific habit, one that Richard had watched for years across boardroom tables and dinner tables and in the rearview mirror of a car on road trips when Ethan was a teenager, and Richard could see him in the mirror doing exactly that, touching his own index finger to his thumb, thinking. Richard said, "Ethan." It was barely a word. It was more like a sound his body made before his mind had authorized it. The young man looked up. He did not run. He did not speak immediately. He looked at Richard Calloway with eyes that held 6 years of things that no face should have to hold, and after a moment, in a voice that was rougher than Richard remembered but pitched in exactly the same register, that same low, careful register that had always sounded too old for whatever age Ethan had been at the time, he said, "I didn't think you'd actually come in." Richard's hand was still on the doorframe. His chest had done something that he could not classify or control. The room was very small and very still, and the lantern threw its warm amber light across both their faces, and outside the window the October afternoon was going golden and cold, and the house that had been holding its breath for 6 years finally, in the space of those 4 words, began to exhale. Richard Calloway did not move from the doorframe for a long time. His mind, that extraordinary disciplined machine that had processed acquisitions and crises and hostile negotiations without visible effort for 3 decades, was doing nothing useful. It had stopped. He was aware of his own breathing, which was too shallow and too fast. He was aware of the weight of his own body against the doorframe, the slight roughness of the old wood through the fabric of his suit jacket. He was aware, above everything, of the eyes looking back at him from across the room. Those specific eyes, that specific shade of dark brown, set in a face that was thinner and more weathered than it should have been, but was undeniably, irrefutably, the face of his son. 6 years. 6 years of a grave with a name on it. 6 years of a room in the penthouse that he had stopped going into and had never converted into anything else, because converting it would have required making a decision about what it should become now, and that decision was one he had never been able to make. "Ethan," he said again. And again the word came out wrong. Too small, too stripped of everything that should have been around it. Ethan Calloway, 34 years old, alive, sitting on the dusty floor of a house that had been waiting for someone to come back to it, watched his father with an expression that was impossible to fully read. There was caution in it, and exhaustion, and something underneath both of those things that was not yet hope, but was perhaps the space where hope had once lived and might live again, if enough things went differently than they had in the recent years of his life. "I'm going to need you to come away from the door," Ethan said. "You look like you're going to fall." Richard did not move. "Are you real?" His voice was barely above a whisper. He felt the absurdity of the question even as he asked it, but there was no other question available to him in that moment, no more sophisticated approach than the completely raw and undefended one. "I need to know if you're real." "I'm real." Ethan said it simply, without drama, as if he had answered this question before, which, it would later become clear, he had, many times, to himself, mostly in the dark. "Sit down, Dad. Please." Richard crossed the room. He sat down on the floor, which he had not done in probably 15 years, and which his body registered with the protest from both knees. And he sat 2 feet from his son and looked at him in the amber light of the camping lantern and did not speak for a very long time. He was doing what his mind, now slowly coming back online, was capable of doing, cataloging. The scar on Ethan's left temple, small and silver white, that had not been there before. The way the left hand rested differently from the right, slightly curled, slightly protective, as if at some point it had been injured and had healed imperfectly. The eyes were the same. The nose, that nose that Margaret always said was the one thing both her boys had inherited directly from Richard, slightly aquiline, slightly too strong for a boy's face and exactly right for a man's, was the same. "How?" Richard said. Just that word. Ethan drew a breath. He looked at the lantern rather than at his father, and Richard understood instinctively that this was how Ethan managed the telling, by looking at a fixed point, by not watching the reaction to the words as they came out, because watching the reaction would have made the telling impossible. "I need you to listen," Ethan said, "all the way through, before you say anything, because I've tried to tell this story before, to people who interrupted me. And when you interrupt me, I lose the thread, and then I can't keep going." A pause. "Can you do that?" "Yes," Richard said. The word came out with a steadiness he didn't entirely feel. Ethan nodded. He turned the lantern slightly, adjusted something on its base. "The accident was real," he said. "I need you to know that first. I'm not going to tell you the accident didn't happen. It happened. Route 9, November, the rain. The car went off the curve. I don't remember the impact. I remember the rain on the windshield, and then I remember waking up and there was a tube in my throat and I couldn't move my hands and I didn't know where I was or what my name was or anything. Nothing. Blank." Richard was very still. "The hospital was in Carver County, St. Agatha's Medical Center, 200 miles from here. I ended up there because the ambulance from the first scene was redirected. There was a multiple vehicle accident on the main highway that night, and St. Agatha's was taking overflow. I was unconscious. I had no ID. My wallet had gone somewhere in the crash. I was John Doe for 12 days. He paused. 12 days, he said again, as if the number still surprised him. They didn't know who I was, and I didn't know who I was. The amnesia, they said it was traumatic, retrograde. They said it was common with the type of head injury I had. It wasn't permanent, but it was slow. Things came back in pieces. My name came back after about 3 weeks. Before it came back, someone had already declared me dead." Richard's jaw tightened. He said nothing. By the time I could speak clearly enough to tell people who I was, by the time I could say Ethan Calloway, by the time I had a name to give them, Ethan stopped. His jaw worked. There were no records of me being alive. The death certificate had been filed. Someone had filed it, and whoever filed it had made sure that any attempt I made to contact the family was not going to reach anyone. "Who?" Richard said. He had promised to listen without interrupting, and he broke the promise, because there was only one question, and it was that one. Ethan looked at him directly for the first time since Richard had sat down. "I'm going to tell you," Ethan said, "but I need you to hear the rest first, because if I tell you who before I tell you everything else, you're going to leave this room and go do something and I'm not going to be able to finish, and you need to understand all of it. You need to understand what they did and how they did it, and for how long before you know who." Richard's hands were pressed flat against his own thighs, pressing down, a physical practice for containing the thing that was rising in his chest like water in a flooding room. "Keep going," he said. Ethan looked back at the lantern. The hospital. There was a doctor there, Dr. Marcus Webb. He knew who I was. He figured it out before I did, actually, from a photograph that someone brought in, someone who came to the hospital, someone who was not there to help me. He said the name of the person who had come to the hospital. Richard heard it, and the room did something that rooms in Richard Calloway's experience had never done before. It contracted. The walls came slightly closer. The air thinned. The amber light of the lantern seemed to pulse once, like a heartbeat. Victor. The name sat in the room between them like something that had weight and temperature. Victor Calloway, 58 years old, Richard's younger brother by 3 years, a man who wore his second-place status in the family like a wound he'd been nursing for 5 decades, always slightly off to the side of every photograph, always slightly louder than necessary in every room, always watching from a position just left of center, never quite the main story. Victor, who had been a junior partner in the early days of the Calloway Group and who had been bought out to a minority stake in a restructuring 12 years ago. Victor, who sat on the periphery of the company's board and received a quarterly distribution and attended the annual meetings, and smiled at Richard with the particular smile of a man who has decided that waiting is a valid strategy. Victor, who had called Richard the night of Ethan's death with a voice full of careful grief and who had stood at the funeral with his hand on Richard's arm and his eyes moving, even then, even in that moment, over the room calculating. "He came to the hospital," Ethan said. "He saw me. He spoke to Dr. Webb. I don't know exactly what was said. I was barely conscious. I wasn't in that room. But afterward, Webb started behaving differently toward me, more distant, less forthcoming about my case. And then the hospital records, my actual records, the ones that showed I was alive and being treated, disappeared from the system. I found out later, much later, from a nurse who was there that year, that there was a man in a good suit who visited the records department, that the access logs from that week were corrupted, that Webb received a payment to a personal account 6 weeks after that visit." Ethan reached into the flannel shirt's breast pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it for a moment before handing it to Richard. It was a photocopy, handwritten in precise, small script, a list of dates and amounts that were significant, amounts that, to someone who had spent his career reading financial records, told a very specific story. Richard looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. "Where did you get this?" he said. "Thomas," Ethan said. "Thomas Osei. He found me. About 8 months after the accident. He'd been looking. He drove out to every hospital within a 300-mile radius and asked for any John Doe admitted in that November. He found me on his 3rd try." Thomas Osei. Richard knew the name immediately. His former driver, not Collins, but the one before Collins. A man who had worked for the Calloway family for 15 years, who had driven Ethan to school and to football practice and to the airport and to countless other places, who had been present for more of Ethan's growing up than Richard himself had managed. Thomas, who had been quietly let go from the family's employment about a year after Ethan's supposed death, in a wave of staff restructuring that Victor had recommended and Richard had approved without asking many questions, because he had been in the deepest pit of his grief and was not asking questions about anything. "Thomas found you," Richard said. "Thomas found me. He visited me at St. Agatha's and he wept at my bedside, and he told me my name, and he brought me photographs that he'd kept on his own phone, photographs of me, of the family, of everything. And he sat with me for 6 hours and helped me remember what he could help me remember, And then he told me what he had pieced together about why I was still there, and you were not coming for me. Ethan's voice had stayed controlled throughout all of this. The control was not coldness. It was the specific control of someone who has told a story so many times inside their own head, rehearsed it so many times in the dark, that the words have become load-bearing walls rather than fresh wounds. They supported the structure. They did not bleed. He told you about Victor, Richard said. Not directly. Not at first. He told me that something had gone wrong with the notification process, that he had tried to reach you directly when he started searching for me, and that his calls had been blocked, that a message he had sent to your office had received a legal response, not from you, but from a law firm he'd never heard of, threatening action if he continued to attempt contact with the Calloway family regarding the matter of Ethan Calloway, deceased. His words, deceased, in a legal letter, about a man who was sitting in a hospital bed breathing. The paper in Richard's hands shook slightly. He made his hands still. A law firm, he said. Harmon, Briggs, and Associates. They were retained by someone to send that letter. Thomas couldn't prove who had retained them. Not then. It took years. Years? Richard said. Years, Ethan said. Dad, I need you to understand something. I spent the first year after I recovered my memory trying to prove that I existed. I had no identification. My birth certificate, the original, had been flagged as belonging to a deceased individual in every government database Thomas tried to access. My social security number returned a death flag. When I tried to get a replacement driver's license, the system showed that a death report had been filed for my number. I was, on paper, not alive. Every official record of my existence had been converted into a record of my absence. Richard set the paper down on the dusty floor between them. He pressed both hands over his face. He stayed like that for what might have been 30 seconds, or might have been much longer, and Ethan did not rush him, did not speak, sat very still in the way that he had learned to sit still, with patience that had been purchased at an enormous cost, and that was now simply part of his architecture. Richard lowered his hands. His eyes were dry. Whatever was happening in his chest was not going to express itself in tears here, in this room, because tears were not the right shape for what he was feeling. What he was feeling was larger than tears. It was the specific anguish of someone who has been conducting a grief for 6 years and now discovers that the grief was a lie constructed by someone else's hand, that the thing he mourned had been alive the whole time, 100 miles away, trying to reach him, being blocked at every turn by someone who wore his family's name. Tell me the rest, Richard said. His voice was very quiet now. All of it. The rest took a long time to tell. Ethan told it in the way he had learned to tell it, methodically, without editorializing, with the specific care of someone who knows that the facts are damning enough on their own and do not need emotional embellishment. He told Richard about the apartment in Carver County that Thomas had helped him find when he was finally discharged from St. Agatha's, a single room above a dry cleaning business, $60 a week, with a hot plate and a window that looked out onto a parking lot. He told him about the years of working cash jobs, construction, loading docks, a restaurant kitchen, because without documentation, he could not be officially employed, and without official employment, he could not rebuild the documentation, and the circle was designed to be inescapable. He told Richard about the lawyer that Thomas had eventually found, a woman named Janet Flores, who had taken the case without payment because she had 2 sons of her own and had looked at Ethan's file and felt something happen in her chest that she described later as moral necessity. He told Richard about the attempt to access the hospital records electronically, the discovery that the original records had been purged, and then, the turning point, the revelation that a copy existed. Dr. Carlin Deeby, Ethan said. She was the attending physician in the emergency room when I came in. She was the one who kept me alive in the first 48 hours. She was the one who noticed that the records purge had happened and that it was wrong. She couldn't prove anything yet, but she kept copies. Everything, every admission note, every scan, every treatment record. She put them in a folder and took them home and put them in a locked box in her attic, and she told her husband that if anything ever happened to her, the box needed to go to a lawyer. She kept copies for 7 years, Richard said. She kept copies for 6 years, Ethan said, Because she knew something was wrong. Because in 22 years of emergency medicine, she had never had a patient's records disappear like that, and had never been approached by a man who was not family and not law enforcement and asked questions about a patient's care that no one with a legitimate interest would ask. She knew something was wrong, and she held on to those copies the way you hold on to something when you're not sure yet what it proves. But you're sure it proves something. Richard was quiet for a moment. "She'll give them to us," he said. It was not quite a question. "She already agreed," Ethan said. "Thomas contacted her 2 months ago. She's been waiting. She's been waiting for someone with enough ability to actually use them." The word he had almost used, Richard understood, was power. Someone with enough power to actually use them. His son had spent 6 years in a limbo of powerlessness, armed with the truth and stripped of every mechanism for making the truth matter, waiting for the moment when the truth could be delivered to the one person in the world with the resources and the authority to do something about it. And the person he had been waiting for had taken 6 years to walk through the front door of the right house. "Victor," Richard said. He said it the way you say the name of something you have been avoiding naming. Carefully, with full awareness of what the naming costs. Victor orchestrated the whole thing. He saw an opportunity, Ethan said. The accident was real. He didn't cause the accident, but the accident gave him a situation and he built a cover on top of it. If I was confirmed dead, the shares that would have passed to me through your estate planning, the stake that you had designated for me specifically, would have reverted to the family trust, where Victor's influence was considerable. Thomas found the records of what happened to that designation after the death certificate was filed. Victor had been working on the board of the trust for 2 years. The redirection of those shares into a structure that benefited him directly happened within 8 months of the certificate being filed. Richard said nothing. The number in his head was substantial. He did not say it aloud. He did not need to. He paid the doctor, Richard said. He paid to have the records destroyed. He had the law firm send Thomas those letters. He did all of that, and he had you watched in a way. Not invasively, just there was someone in your staff in the early years after the accident who was reporting to him. Someone who would have flagged it if you'd started asking questions or hiring investigators. Thomas believes that person was let go around the same time as Thomas himself, once Victor felt the situation was stable. Richard stood up from the floor. His knees registered the protests they had been accumulating, and he ignored them. He walked to the window. The October afternoon was dimming now into the early dusk, the thin gold light going orange and then a deep rose at the edges. He looked out at the street where Ethan had learned to ride a bicycle. The bicycle had been red. He had bought it at a hardware store 2 towns over because the hardware store in Greenfield had been out of red ones, and Ethan had specifically requested red. He remembered that. He had driven 45 minutes for a red bicycle, and he had felt, at the time, mildly put out by the inconvenience, and he would have driven 4 hours without complaint if he had known it was going to matter so much to remember. He turned back to his son. "You've been here for how long?" he said. "In the house. 3 weeks. Ethan looked around the room with an expression that was not quite apology and not quite pride. "I couldn't think of anywhere else to go. I needed to be somewhere I knew was real. This was real. The lantern. Hardware store 2 towns over. They still carry the camping supply section in the same aisle." A pause. "I came in through the back. The lock on the kitchen door has been broken since 2014. Despite everything, or perhaps because of everything, because of the accumulated weight of the past hour in this room, Richard almost smiled. Something moved through his chest that was entirely new and entirely painful and entirely unlike anything he had a name for. "I'm going to make a call," he said. "To Victor?" "Not yet." Richard reached for his phone. "To Dana. I need someone to start pulling records. Tonight." He looked at Ethan. "And I'm going to need you to come with me." Ethan looked at him steadily. The caution was still in his eyes, and Richard recognized it now for what it was. Not stubbornness, not resentment, but the specific wariness of someone who has been promised help before and has learned at considerable cost not to invest in promises until they had been kept. Where? Ethan said. Somewhere warm, Richard said. Somewhere with a door that locks. Somewhere that is not the floor of a house that hasn't had heat in 3 years. He paused. My hotel. I have a suite. You'll have your own room. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached over and picked up the camping lantern. He clicked it off. In the sudden darkness, with only the faint last light of the October dusk coming through the grimy window, they were both just shapes, a father and a son, in a room that had been waiting. All right, Ethan said. Let's go. Dana Reeves, when Richard called her at 5:47 that evening from the car, listened to what he told her with the stillness of someone who has been trained by years of experience to hold the shape of calm regardless of what is being poured into it. She asked 4 questions. She wrote down what he told her. She said she would start that night. She did not express shock, which was why Richard trusted her. She expressed readiness, which was why he had kept her for 11 years. By 9 o'clock, she had already accessed the internal financial records of the Callaway Group Trust and identified 3 anomalous transactions from the year following Ethan's supposed death. Transfers to a holding company called Grayfield Management LLC, whose beneficial ownership would require a corporate attorney to fully unwind, but whose registration address was associated, through 2 layers of documentation, with an office suite that also appeared in Victor Callaway's personal expense records. By 11 o'clock, she had cross-referenced the name Harmon, Briggs & Associates against every legal invoice that had passed through any Callaway-associated entity for the past 8 years and found, in a disbursement record from a subsidiary that Richard had not looked at personally in 4 years, a payment of $47,000 made to that firm in the January following the accident. The notation in the record said, Estate Consultation Services. Estate Consultation Services. Richard sat in the hotel suite's living room with the document spread across the coffee table, while Ethan slept in the bedroom behind the closed door. The first real sleep, Richard suspected, that he had managed in weeks, possibly months. Collins had gone to a late-night pharmacy and returned with the items Richard had listed: toiletries, clean clothing in the right size, a proper meal. The clothing sat in a bag beside the door. The meal had been eaten in nearly complete silence, with the specific silence of 2 people who have too much to say and are wise enough not to try to say it all at once. Richard looked at the documents. $47,000. Estate Consultation Services. Paid to the firm that had sent Thomas Osei legal threats for trying to find his employer's living son. He poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon from the minibar. He did not drink it. He looked at it for a while, the way he had looked at a glass of bourbon in a kitchen a long time ago, waiting for the night to end. Then he picked up the phone and called Thomas Osei. The call connected on the second ring. Mr. Callaway, Thomas said. His voice, after all these years, was exactly as Richard remembered it, the same deep, careful Ghanaian accent, the same measured delivery. He sounded as though he had been awake and expecting this call. He probably had. Thomas, Richard said. He's here. He's safe. Silence on the line. And then, a sound that Thomas Osei, 52 years old, a man who had driven the Callaway family through 15 years of winters and emergencies and ordinary Tuesdays, allowed to escape before he could stop it. A sound somewhere between exhale and sob, quickly controlled, quickly recovered from, but real. Thank God, Thomas said. I need you to come to Greenfield, Richard said. I need everything you have, every document, every record, every piece of correspondence. I need you to be willing to give a formal statement. I've been willing for 6 years, Mr. Callaway. A pause. I'll be there tomorrow morning. I'll send a car. I know the way, Thomas said. I'll come myself. Richard said, Thomas, thank you for finding him, for staying with him. Another silence. When Thomas spoke again, his voice was very controlled, very precise, in the way of a man keeping himself together through the specific application of dignity. He's a good man, Thomas said. He's been through things that would have ended most people. He's still a good man. A pause. Take care of him, Mr. Callaway. I intend to, Richard said. Good night, Thomas. He ended the call. He sat for a long time with the phone in his hand and the bourbon untouched and the documents spread across the coffee table. Victor Calloway, 58 years old, his brother, the person who had sat at Ethan's funeral and held Richard's arm. Richard let himself feel, for exactly as long as it took to feel it, the full weight of what Victor had done. Not just the practical damage, the years of Ethan's life taken from him, the identity stripped, the financial manipulation, the legal obstruction, but the personal dimension of it, that at the moment of Richard's deepest grief, when he was the most raw and the most undefended he had ever been, Victor had been present with knowledge that would have ended that grief instantly, had stood there, holding his arm, had said he was sorry for Richard's loss, had said he was sorry for a loss that Victor himself had manufactured. Richard sat with that for exactly as long as it took to become something he could use. Then he picked up the phone and called Dana again. "I need you to schedule an emergency board meeting," he said, 2 days from now, "and I need you to contact Dr. Carla Ndebe in Carver County. Here's what I need from her." Thomas Osei arrived the next morning with 2 banker's boxes full of documents. He was a large man, Thomas, broad-shouldered, with a close-cropped silver beard that had not been there in Richard's memory of him, and reading glasses that he wore on a cord around his neck, and that gave him the appearance of a professor who had somehow ended up as a man who drove luxury cars, and had, it turned out, spent 6 years quietly and systematically documenting a conspiracy that most people would have abandoned as unwinnable. He wore a dark green corduroy jacket and a tie that had been tied and retied to perfect precision, because Thomas Osei was the kind of man who believed that how you presented yourself was a statement about how seriously you took the matter at hand, and he took this matter with his entire being. He set the boxes on the hotel suite's dining table and stood beside them with his hands clasped in front of him, and looked at Richard with the expression of a man who has carried something very heavy for a very long time and is finally in a room with someone who can help him put it down properly. Ethan was present too, seated at the table, fresh from the first real night's sleep Richard had seen him take, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug, watching Thomas with the quiet warmth of someone in the presence of one of very few people in the world they completely trusted. "Everything in the left box," Thomas said, "is documentation from the period immediately after the accident. Hospital visit logs, the name of the visitor who came to St. Agatha's. I got those from a nurse who was working the ward that November. She remembered because the visitor made her uncomfortable. He was too well dressed for Carver County and he asked the wrong questions. She kept a personal note about it because she kept personal notes about everything, a habit she described as professional paranoia. I tracked her down 18 months after the accident. She gave me a signed statement." "The nurse's statement is in that box?" Dana said. She was standing beside Richard, a legal pad in her hand. "Signed and notarized," Thomas said. In 2021, she gave an additional statement to Ms. Flores, the lawyer who was assisting Ethan at that time, because we needed it updated and expanded. That version is also in the box." "Good," Dana said, and wrote something. "The right box," Thomas continued, "contains financial records. These I obtained through various means over several years, some of which I am not prepared to discuss in detail, but which will withstand scrutiny because the documents are authentic. I didn't obtain them illegally, I just obtained them through connections that took a long time to develop. There is a record of a payment to a holding company associated with Dr. Marcus Webb. There is a record of the initial payment to the Harmon Briggs firm. There is a record of 3 separate payments to an individual whose name appears in Callaway Group Trust documents as a minority interest holder." He looked at Richard steadily. "Your brother received approximately $2,300,000 in redirected distributions in the 4 years following Ethan's supposed death that would have gone to Ethan's designated account under your estate planning documents. $2,300,000. The room absorbed the number in silence. Ethan looked at his coffee mug. He had known the number. Hearing it said aloud in a room with his father was a different thing from knowing it. Richard said, "Does he know we're looking?" "Not yet," Dana said. "I've been careful about what I've accessed and how. He has a flag on his personnel file. I found it this morning. that alerts him if anyone with executive access opens his financial records. I accessed the trust records through a separate pathway. He shouldn't have been alerted. He's going to find out, Richard said. Yes, Dana said. Probably within the next 24 hours, once the board meeting is scheduled. The notification goes out to all board members. Can we delay the notification? I can structure it as a general strategic review meeting. No specific agenda made public. He'll attend because he always attends. He'll find out what the meeting is actually about when he's in the room. Richard considered this. Do it that way, he said. Dana made a note. Richard looked at Thomas. You'll come to the meeting. You'll speak. Thomas stood straighter, which Richard had not believed was physically possible. I've been ready to speak for 6 years, he said. It would be my honor. And Dr. Ndiba? She's prepared a full package of the documents she retained, Dana said. She's also prepared a written statement from herself, explaining the circumstances under which she retained them and the concerns that motivated her to do so. She'll attend if needed, but believes the documents speak sufficiently for themselves. Richard nodded. He looked across the table at his son. Ethan was watching him with an expression that had shifted overnight. The wariness still present. Yes. The careful holding of hope at arm's length. Yes. But something new underneath it. Something that was assessing and finding tentatively that what was being assessed was not the thing it had been braced to find. You have questions, Richard said. I have about 100 questions, Ethan said, but they can wait. They can't all wait. No. Ethan set the coffee mug down. One of them can't. He looked at his father directly. When this is over, the meeting, the board, all of it, what happens? What happens with me? Who decides what I am, what I'm entitled to, what my life, what my existence looks like? Richard held his gaze. You decide, he said. You decide all of it. I'll give you access to everything, every resource, every legal support, everything you need to rebuild your documentation, your identity, your financial standing, whatever you want. But the decisions about what comes after are yours. He paused. I have not earned the right to make those decisions for you. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Okay, he said. Let's go to the meeting. Victor Calloway arrived at the Calloway Group boardroom on the morning of the second day wearing a charcoal suit and a deep blue tie, and a watch that Richard recognized as the one he had given Victor for his 50th birthday. A gesture of brotherly generosity that felt, in the current light, like a detail from a story about someone he no longer recognized. Victor was 58 years old, and he wore those years with the slightly excessive confidence of a man who had always believed that his turn was coming. He was silver-haired, slightly heavier than Richard remembered from their last meeting 3 months ago, with a tan that spoke of a recent trip somewhere warm. He carried a leather portfolio. His shoes were impeccably shined. He walked into the boardroom and stopped. The room was arranged differently than it normally was for board meetings. The long table was present, and the chairs, and the presentation screens. But the seating arrangement was not the usual configuration, and the people present were not only the usual board members. Thomas Ossie sat along the far wall, in his corduroy jacket and his perfectly tied tie. Dana Reeves sat beside Richard at the head of the table, with 2 banker's boxes and a laptop and a neat stack of printed documents. And beside Dana, close enough that the arrangement was unmistakably intentional, sat Ethan Calloway. Ethan Calloway, 34 years old, wearing clothes that had been purchased the previous afternoon at a shop 2 blocks from the hotel, clean and appropriately formal in dark trousers and a navy sweater, with his hands resting on the table in front of him, index finger touching thumb in a small circle. He looked at his uncle without expression. Victor Calloway looked at his nephew. The tan drained from his face in approximately 4 seconds. To his credit, or perhaps to the credit of whatever survival instinct had made him successful enough at navigating the world for 58 years, he did not immediately flee, did not immediately deny, did not immediately do any of the things that guilt might have driven a less controlled person to do. He stood in the doorway for a moment that stretched itself into something much longer than its actual duration. And then he walked to his seat, set his leather portfolio on the table, and sat down. "Richard," he said. His voice was steady. "I see we have some unexpected attendees today." "We do," Richard said. He was very calm. He had been calm since he woke up that morning, the kind of calm that is not the absence of feeling but the complete subordination of feeling to purpose. "I thought it was important for you to be here in person for this conversation." "Of course," Victor said. He folded his hands on the portfolio. He did not look at Ethan again. What conversation would that be? Richard did not answer immediately. He opened the laptop in front of him and turned the screen to face the room. On it was a photograph, a date-stamped image from the security log of St. Agatha's Medical Center in Carver County, showing a man in a good suit signing in at the reception desk. The image was not high resolution, but it was sufficient. The face was recognizable to anyone in the room who knew it. "This was taken on November 23rd, 6 years ago," Richard said, 11 days after the accident on Route 9. He looked at Victor. "That's you." Victor looked at the photograph. His expression did not change. "That could be anyone," he said. "The sign-in log from that day shows the name given as Victor Marsh," Richard said, "which is the maiden name of your mother's sister, who you've used as a reference identity before in hotel bookings and personal registrations." He let that settle. "Our legal team found 14 instances over the past 12 years. Victor said nothing. Dana placed a document on the table and slid it toward the center. "This is a statement from Nurse Patricia Albright, who was working the ward at St. Agatha's on that date. She describes a visitor matching your description, asking specific questions about the condition and identity of an unidentified patient in room 412. She placed a second document beside it. "This is the payment record for Dr. Marcus Webb, $48,000, transferred from Grayfield Management LLC to a personal account belonging to Webb, 7 weeks after your visit to the hospital." Victor's jaw tightened. "Grayfield Management LLC," Richard said, "is a company registered to a holding entity that traces, through 2 intermediary registrations, to a law office that has handled several of your personal financial arrangements over the past decade. We have the corporate registration chain here." Dana produced more documents. "We also have the disbursement record from the Callaway Family Trust showing 3 separate redirections totaling $2,300,000 into accounts that were restructured after Ethan's death certificate was filed, restructured in ways that benefited your stake specifically." Victor looked at the documents. Then he looked at Richard. "You can't prove intent," he said. His voice was still controlled, but there was something underneath the control now that had not been there 5 minutes ago. "Even if everything you're saying is accurate, and I'm not conceding that it is, you cannot prove that I knew he was alive. You cannot prove that any of this was deliberate. Accidents happen. Records get corrupted. People make financial decisions after events like—" "Victor," Richard said. The word was not loud. It was very quiet. It had the quality of something final. Victor stopped. "He's sitting across the table from you," Richard said. "My son, your nephew. The person you went to a hospital 200 miles from here to confirm and then to disappear. He's sitting right there. And you haven't said his name." Victor looked at Ethan for the first time since sitting down. Ethan looked back. The silence between them was a specific kind of silence, not empty, but very full of the 6 years that it contained. The letters undelivered, the calls blocked, the legal threats sent to Thomas Osei, who had only been trying to find a living man, the nights in a one-room apartment above a dry cleaner in Carver County, the years of cash jobs and borrowed identities, and the particular despair of being a real person that the world has decided is not real. Ethan did not look away. Victor looked away first. He looked down at the leather portfolio and he opened it and he closed it again, and it was, Richard thought, the most human thing he had seen his brother do in perhaps 15 years. "I'm going to need to speak with my attorney," Victor said. "You're welcome to do that," Richard said. "But before you leave this room, I want you to understand exactly what is going to happen, so that there are no misunderstandings about the path forward." He picked up a document from the stack in front of him, a formally prepared letter, reviewed the previous night by Richard's own legal team. You are going to be removed from the Callaway Group Board, effective today. Your minority stake is going to be subject to a full forensic audit, and any amount found to have been obtained through the manipulation of estate documents or trust records is going to be recovered. You are going to face a criminal referral, fraud, identity suppression, and conspiracy, and the full cooperation of every witness in this room and every document on this table will be made available to the relevant authorities. Victor's face had gone very still. And if I don't sign, he said. Then everything goes to the press tomorrow morning, Richard said. Every document, Thomas's testimony, Dr. Ndib's records, the hospital photograph, all of it. I would prefer to handle this through proper legal channels, because I think that is the right way to do it. But I am not going to protect you. That time is over. Victor looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the document. Then, with the specific quality of a man choosing the lesser of two losses, he picked up the pen that Dana had placed beside the document and he signed it. He did not say he was sorry. Richard did not ask him to. Some things are beyond the reach of apology, and to request the words when the meaning cannot possibly be present would be to make a mockery of the thing that the words are supposed to mean. Richard Callaway had spent 61 years learning which battles were worth fighting and which were beyond resolution. Victor's genuine contrition was in the second category. The legal and financial accountability was in the first. Victor Callaway picked up his leather portfolio and walked out of the boardroom. Thomas Osei, along the far wall, watched him go with an expression of settled, quiet satisfaction. Dana immediately picked up her phone and began making the calls that needed to be made. Richard sat for a moment, very still, at the head of the table, and then he looked at his son. Ethan was looking back at him. Something had shifted in his face, a slight loosening around the eyes, a release of something that had been held tightly for a very long time. Not relief exactly, because relief is simple and this was not simple, but something in that direction. Something that lived in the same neighborhood as relief and was moving toward it. That's it, Ethan said. That's the beginning of it, Richard said. The rest will take time. How much time? Long enough to do it right. Richard stood. But we have time. We have as much time as we need. He walked around the table to where his son was sitting. He stood beside him. Ethan looked up at him, and Richard Callaway, who had stood at his son's funeral and shaken 60 hands and thanked 60 people, and not cried and gone home and sat in a kitchen with a glass of bourbon he couldn't drink and stared at a refrigerator until dawn. Richard Callaway put his hand on his son's shoulder and kept it there, and the weight of it was the weight of 6 years of grief being converted, by the slow and difficult alchemy of the living, into something that had a future. Margaret Callaway arrived in Greenfield on the afternoon of the third day. She drove herself, which Richard had expected. Margaret had always preferred to drive herself to the things that mattered most. It was a specific form of agency, this insistence on being the one who held the wheel when the destination was significant. She arrived in a rental car, practical and silver gray, which she parked with precision in front of the hotel, and she came through the lobby with the particular walk that Richard had known for 30 years. Purposeful, unhurried, carrying exactly as much of herself in the room as she intended to carry, which was all of it. She was 60 years old. She had been beautiful at 30, and she was more completely herself at 60. The kind of woman whose appearance communicated not what she had lost to time, but what time had clarified. Her hair was silver now, worn simply, and she had the kind of bone structure that age honored rather than diminished. She wore a camel coat and simple dark trousers and the pearl earrings that she had bought for herself on their 25th wedding anniversary, because Richard had forgotten the date and she had decided, quietly and without drama, that she would buy them herself and that this would be fine, because she was a woman who knew how to take care of herself, which was a skill she had needed more and more as the marriage had slowly, painfully worn through its final years. Richard met her in the lobby. They stood for a moment, looking at each other with the specific look of two people who have shared everything and lost each other, and are now standing in the aftermath of something enormous that they both need a moment to account for. "He's upstairs," Richard said. Margaret's jaw tightened and then released. Her eyes went bright, briefly, before she controlled it. She nodded. "How is he?" she said. "Tired," Richard said. "Thinner than he should be, but himself, very much himself." Her mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile and not quite a cry, somewhere between the two. "I've been on the road since 6 this morning," she said. "I would have driven through the night if the call had come any later." "I know." They went up together in the elevator in silence. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have nothing to prove to each other anymore, and everything to simply be in the presence of. Richard knocked on the door of the suite's second bedroom. Ethan opened it. What happened in the next moment was something that was in some ways beyond description and in others completely simple. Margaret made a sound that was barely a sound, a single intake of breath. And then she had both arms around her son and her face pressed against his shoulder, and she was shaking. The kind of shaking that comes from 6 years of compressed grief, finding suddenly that the thing it was grieving is present and real and breathing and alive. And Ethan had both arms around his mother, and his eyes were closed and his chin was down against the top of her silver hair, and they stood like that in the doorway of a hotel room in Greenfield for a very long time. Richard stood in the hall. He did not go in. He stood in the hall with his hands at his sides and his eyes on the two of them, and on his face was an expression that no one from his professional life would have recognized. Completely undefended, completely open, completely without the armoring that 61 years had built, and that the past 3 days had, piece by piece, begun to dismantle. After a while, Ethan looked up over his mother's shoulder and saw Richard standing there. He held his gaze for a moment. Then he shifted slightly, creating space, and looked at his father with an expression that was the most direct communication that had passed between them. He was not asking Richard to leave. Richard understood. He stepped forward. He put his arms around both of them, his ex-wife and his son, the two people from whom the past 6 years had stolen everything and returned nothing, and held on. That evening, when Margaret had settled into a room down the hall and Ethan had eaten more than Richard had seen him eat in 3 days, and the worst of the immediate business was handled, and the three of them were sitting in the suite's living room with tea cooling in cups on the coffee table, Ethan did something that Richard did not expect. He produced a box. It was a metal box, the kind sold in hardware stores for storing important documents, about the size of a hardcover book, painted a flat gray, with a small lock that had been forced at some point and never repaired. He set it on the table. "I've been carrying this for 4 years, he said. Richard looked at it. "Can I open it?" he said. "That's why I put it on the table," Ethan said. Richard lifted the lid. Inside, layered in careful order, were documents. But not the legal documents, not the hospital records or the financial trail. These were different. On top was a photograph. Richard and Ethan, outside this very hotel, taken some 15 years ago when Richard had been doing business in Greenfield and had brought Ethan along for a weekend. Some paternal instinct briefly overcoming the work habit. And someone, Margaret probably, with Richard's old camera, had taken the photograph as they stood on the sidewalk with the sun in their faces, and Richard's hand on the back of Ethan's neck in a gesture that was his version of affection, the only version he had known how to offer then. Beneath the photograph was a letter. Richard recognized the handwriting as Ethan's, a slightly cramped, leftward-leaning script. The letter was dated 3 years ago. "You don't have to read it now," Ethan said. "Is it?" Richard stopped. "Is it for me?" "Eventually," Ethan said. "I wrote it when I didn't think I was going to be able to reach you, when I thought—" He stopped too. "Read it when you're ready, not tonight." Richard placed the letter back in the box. He looked at the photograph for a moment longer. Then he closed the lid. The box, gray metal, forced lock, 4 years of carrying. He set it on the side table beside his chair, where he could see it. "I need to say something," Richard said. He looked at his son. "And I need to say it directly, without dressing it up or making it more complicated than it is." Ethan was watching him. "I was not a present father," Richard said. Before any of this happened, before the accident, before the funeral, before 6 years before any of it, I was not present in the ways that mattered. I was there, physically, with some consistency, but I was not available. I was not listening. I was not. He paused. I was not easy to talk to, and I know that. And I'm telling you that I know it because I don't want to reconstruct the past as something it wasn't just because what came after it was terrible. You deserve an honest account. Ethan held his gaze steadily. I know, he said. I'm going to do better, Richard said. Not because I owe you a better version of myself as some kind of payment for what happened. I don't think that framing is right. But because I want to. Because the past 6 years. His voice changed. Not broke, not cracked, but changed in register, lowered, became something raw. The past 6 years I believed I had lost you. And whatever I was before that, I am not willing to go back to being that person on the other side of it. Margaret was very quiet across the room. Ethan said after a moment, I don't want an apology. I want a different dad going forward. There's a difference. I know the difference, Richard said. Good, Ethan said. They sat for a moment. I want to ask you something, Ethan said. And I need you to answer honestly, not the way you think I want you to answer. All right, Richard said. The house, Ethan said. The house on Millrace Road. Why didn't you demolish it? You signed the papers twice. Why? Richard was quiet for a moment. Because demolishing it would have meant deciding what to do with the space it left, he said. And I couldn't decide that. I couldn't convert that space into anything else because the house was the last real place. The last place that was real before everything became theoretical. Before he became. He stopped. He looked at his son. Before you became a memory instead of a person. And you kept the memory alive by keeping the house, Ethan said. I suppose that's what I was doing, Richard said. Yes. Ethan nodded slowly. I came back to the house, he said, because it was the last place I was certain was real. He looked at Richard. We both came back to the same place for the same reason. The room held that for a moment. What do you want to do with it? Richard asked. Fix it up, Ethan said. Not tear it down. Fix it up. He paused. But properly. With actual heat. Richard said, the heating system in that house was outdated when I bought it in 1990. I know, Ethan said. I nearly froze 3 times last week. It came out of him before he could organize it. Not a laugh exactly, more like the sound that a laugh makes when it arrives unexpectedly after a very long time without laughter. Richard made the sound, and Margaret covered her mouth across the room, and then Ethan made it too, and for a moment, in a hotel room in Greenfield on an October evening, with a metal box on the side table and a banker's box of documents in the corner, and 3 months of work still ahead of them to undo 6 years of damage, the 3 of them were something that they had not been in a very long time. They were a family, imperfect, incomplete, carrying scars that would always be visible. But a family. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing in the aftermath of something this complex is ever simple. And anyone who tells you otherwise has not lived through it. Ethan's documentation had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Birth certificate reissued, Social Security number restored, driver's license applied for with the assistance of Janet Flores, who continued to give her time without charge because she had looked at this case in 2020 and made a decision about it that she had never stopped being right about. The criminal referral against Victor Calloway was processed by the appropriate authorities and resulted, over the following months, in formal charges of fraud, identity document falsification, and conspiracy. Dr. Marcus Webb, confronted with the evidence and facing his own professional reckoning, cooperated with investigators and confirmed the payment he had received and the instructions he had followed. Victor's assets were frozen pending the outcome of the criminal proceedings, and the redirected distributions from the family trust were placed in escrow while the forensic accounting was completed. Victor did not visit Richard, he did not call, he did not write. The only communication that came through was through attorneys, and it was the communication of a man who had decided that his sole remaining objective was damage limitation. The brother who had held Richard's arm at a funeral was not a person Richard had any further conversation with. The grief of that, the additional grief of losing a brother on top of everything else, was real, and Richard did not pretend it wasn't, and he sat with it when it arrived, which was his new practice, sitting with things instead of standing beside them and telling them to be quiet. Ethan moved into the Greenfield house once the renovations were sufficiently advanced, which took 3 months. The heating system was replaced first, then the plumbing, then the roof, which had developed a leak over the second bedroom that had been contributing to a damp smell since at least 2019. Richard paid for all of it without being asked, which was not the same as making amends, but was one of the forms that practical love takes when the other forms are still being figured out. Ethan supervised the work himself, which meant he was in Greenfield most days, and Richard found reasons to be in Greenfield most weeks. They ate dinner together, on Thursdays usually, sometimes with Margaret, who was navigating her own reckoning with what had happened and doing it, as she did everything, with extraordinary grace and deep privacy. Sometimes just the two of them. Richard asked questions that he had never known how to ask. Ethan answered them. Ethan asked questions of his own. Richard answered those too, with a candor he had never previously applied to conversations with his son, because the old reasons for withholding, the sense that distance was leadership, that privacy was strength, that showing the inside of yourself to your child was a form of weakness, had all been re-examined and found to be, comprehensively, wrong. The renovated house on Millrace Road had a new coat of paint the color of the original brick, warm and dark red against the November sky. The kitchen had been modernized. The back porch had been rebuilt, the new wood still bright and raw-smelling in the cold. In the backyard, where the packed dirt had been, there was now a proper lawn. Just grass, simple, nothing elaborate, because Ethan had been specific about not making the house something it wasn't. One evening in November, exactly 6 weeks after the board meeting, Richard arrived at the house to find Ethan in the backyard in the last of the light, standing in the middle of the lawn looking at the new fence that had just been installed along the back boundary. Richard walked out through the kitchen door and stood beside his son. The evening was cold, the sky going from blue to navy at the horizon, the first stars just becoming visible over the roof line. "Good fence," Richard said. "Strong posts," Ethan said. They stood in companionable silence for a moment. "I spoke to the corporate attorney today," Ethan said, "about the board seat." Richard looked at him. "The seat that would have been mine," Ethan said. "Eventually, the one you had designated." "Yes," Richard said carefully. "I don't want it right now," Ethan said. "I'm not ready for it, and I don't want to take something I haven't earned just because it was supposed to be mine. That's not how I want to do things." He looked at Richard. "But in a few years, if I've built something in the interim, if I come to it because I've earned the right to be there, and not because of what was done to me, I'd want to have the conversation then." Richard nodded slowly. "That's how I'd want it too," he said. "That's the right way." "Okay," Ethan said. The stars were clearer now. The cold had the particular quality of late autumn cold, clean, with an edge, honest about what was coming. "Dad," Ethan said. The word, that specific word, which Richard had not heard in 6 years, which no one had said to him in 6 years, which had lived in the category of the lost, arrived with a force that Richard had not entirely prepared for, even knowing that this moment would come, even having anticipated it. It arrived and went through him like a current. "Yeah," he said. His voice was steady, barely. "You're going to keep coming to Greenfield," Ethan said. It was not quite a question. "Every week," Richard said. "More if you want." Ethan looked at the fence. His hands were in his pockets against the cold. His left hand was still slightly curled, the healed injury still making itself known in the cold weather. His face in the November evening was the face of his son, thinner, more weathered, Older by 6 years than it should have been, but his. Every week, Ethan said. He let the words settle. That works. They stood in the backyard of the house on Mill Race Road while the night came in. Two men learning the shape of a relationship that had been interrupted and was now, carefully, in the patient and honest way of things that have earned the right to try again, being resumed. The house behind them had light in every window, not the pale October light of a camping lantern. Real light, warm and steady, the light of a house that had been recalled from its silence and made functional again, made a home again, by the simple and difficult act of the right people finally coming back to it. The narrator pauses here, at the edge of this story, and says what needs to be said. There is a kind of love that cannot survive silence. Richard Calloway had the love, always, even when he did not know how to show it, even when the showing came out wrong, as firmness or distance or presence that did not translate into warmth. He had the love and he lost the practice of it, and he might have spent the rest of his life in the empty space that loss makes if the chance to reclaim it had not arrived in a dusty room with a camping lantern and 6 years of accumulated weight waiting in the amber light. And there is a kind of evil that convinces itself it is practical. Victor Calloway did not think of himself as a monster. Monsters rarely do. He thought of himself as a man who had been overlooked and undervalued for too long, who had seen an opportunity and taken it. This is how most acts of profound harm are authorized. Not by malice for its own sake, but by the very human mechanism of deciding that what we want badly enough is ours to take. The accounting that followed was not revenge. It was the world correcting itself, the way the world does, imperfectly and too slowly, and with costs that cannot be fully recovered, but correcting nonetheless. Ethan Calloway spent 6 years proving that it is possible to remain a good person in conditions designed to strip goodness away. He did not emerge from those years without damage. He emerged intact, which is not the same thing, but is, in the circumstances, extraordinary. Do not wait for the terrible thing to make you say what matters. Do not wait for the proof that you were wrong to reach you. The door to the house on Mill Race Road was unlocked the whole time. The door to the people you love is almost always unlocked. It only requires that you walk through it. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed creating it. Like, share, and comment on the lessons you've learned. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. See you in my next.